Paul Rosen calls me somewhere in early March to tell me that they have reason to believe that someone is hacking into Alicia Lane's email accounts and they have suspicions, and he'd like to show me what they've got. So I reach out to the cyber squad at the FBI and end up getting Brian assigned.
With Menti's attempt to kind of put his thumb on the scale of justice with respect to Lane's ongoing legal battle by leaking information that could have had a really significant impact. He was trying to take the outcome of her legal battle into his own hands and alter its course to his benefit.
Welcome to episode 376 of FBI Case File Review with Jerry Williams. I'm a retired agent on a mission to show you who the FBI is and what the FBI does through my books, my blog, and my podcast case reviews with former colleagues. Today, we get to speak to retired agent Brian Herrick and retired Assistant United States Attorney, AUSA, Mike Levy. They review the computer hacking investigation and prosecution of former Philadelphia CBS affiliate news anchor Larry Menti, who hacked into the email accounts of his co-anchor Alicia Lane and leaked private information about her to the media. Menti was charged with intentionally accessing a protected computer without authorization. It was a major scandal closely followed by the Philadelphia news media and the public. Brian Herrick, who is an adjunct professor at Westchester University, and Mike Levy, who is a professor at Penn Law School, both use this case as a teaching tool. Brian Herrick served in the FBI for 20 years. Early in his bureau career, he led a computer intrusion task force, was an FBI CART, digital forensic examiner, and conducted technical and investigative training as a police instructor. Brian also worked extensively with global partners through the FBI's International Task Force. He was an assistant legal attaché based in Frankfurt, Germany, where he worked computer intrusion and child sexual exploitation matters with his German law enforcement partners. Later in his career, he was promoted to a supervisory position at FBI headquarters, where he led the FBI's Violent Crimes Against Children and Human Trafficking section. Prior to his retirement, Brian was an assistant special agent in charge, ASAC, in the Philadelphia field office. Currently, Brian serves as vice president of child victim identification for Thorn. Thorn's mission is to transform how children are protected from sexual abuse and exploitation in the digital age. Mike Levy graduated from the University of Pennsylvania Law School in 1969. In the 1970s, he worked as a public defender, an assistant district attorney, and had his own law practice. In 1980, he joined the United States Attorney's Office in Philadelphia, where he prosecuted tax, fraud, labor racketeering, organized crime, and drug cases. He served as an assistant United States attorney, deputy chief of the criminal division, first assistant U.S. attorney, and interim United States attorney of the Eastern District of Pennsylvania twice. In 2001, he became chief of computer crimes. He retired in 2019 and continues to teach cybercrime and evidence at the University of Pennsylvania Law School. Now, before we get to the case review, I have to tell you how much I loved my 2 weeks visiting Thailand. I got back on Saturday. Look out for my very delayed November Reader Team email later this week, where I share my surprising observations about the local police in Bangkok and a few photos from my trip. I'm recording this intro the day before I fly to Delaware to give my Wilmington University True Crime Series talk about the FBI in books, TV, and movies. Let's hope my plane doesn't get canceled. If I make it there, but you weren't able to attend, don't worry. In the November Reader Team email, I'll also cover part of my presentation. In your podcast app's description of this episode, there's a link to where you can join my reader team, buy me a cup of coffee, and visit my website to check out my books and this episode's show notes. Thank you for your support. Now here's the show. I want to welcome my guest, retired agent Brian Herrick, and retired Assistant United States Attorney and Chief of the Eastern District of Pennsylvania Computer Crime Section, Mike Levy. Hi, guys.
How you doing, Jerry?
Hey, Jerry. Good to talk to you.
I want you to know that I've been doing this for almost 10 years, and I have always wanted to have an agent come on with the prosecutor within AUSA to talk about a case. And I have tried and tried and tried. And thank you, Mike. I reached out to you on LinkedIn and told you my dream as far as an episode like this, and you agreed to come on with Brian to talk about this case that I remember oh so well. I mean, it was a major news story and scandal. So, where do we want to start? Who wants to start?
I'll give it a start, and I'll give a little bit of context before we even start talking about the case. But I'd be remiss, Jerry, if I didn't start by saying that what a privilege it is for me to be on this podcast with, quite frankly, two of the favorite people that I worked with when I was on board as an agent with the FBI, a prosecutor, and Mike Levy, that I work side by side. And Mike and I work numerous cases. This was one of them. This was certainly a fun one to work. But worked many other cases with Mike in my time up in the Eastern District. And Jerry, I was like a protege under you. You were leading the media. You were the media coordinator in Philadelphia. I was a backup coordinator covering for you when you were out. But everything I learned about how to deal with the media, I learned from the best. I learned from you.
Oh, thank you.
Really a pleasure to be here and to share the podcast with you both. This is the Larry Menti case. There are people, I'm certain, that'll listen to this podcast who have no idea who Larry Menti, our subject, or Alicia Lane, our victim, are. If you're not from the Philadelphia market, you may not. Although, Larry started his media career elsewhere. Larry in the mid 90s was on Access Hollywood. He was the face of Access Hollywood. And then I think it was towards the late 1990s, he came to Philadelphia. Originally started in Philadelphia on the NBC affiliate, the NBC News affiliate here. But in the early 2000s, around 2003, he moved over to CBS, and that's the KYW is the affiliate here in Philadelphia for CBS News. And so he became the lead anchor in the 2003 timeframe. And ironically, right around that same time is when Alicia Lane joined. So Alicia was a news anchor herself down in the Miami market in 2003, was brought up by CBS. And so she joined KYW right around that time. And KYW, if you follow these kinds of things, was not like the leading network back in the early 2000s. It was probably NBC, if I had to guess. But I do remember distinctly that these two co-anchors, Larry Menti and Alicia Lane, were kind of a dynamic duo of news anchors. They seemed to have some on-scene chemistry when they did the news. They did a lot of events outside of the news as well for the community in Philadelphia. And so it seems like they kind of turned around the ratings for CBS at the time. And they certainly, when this case starts, the end of 2007, 2008, they were like the number one news anchors. So it's a 6 o'clock and 11 o'clock news hour. These were the two that you would see delivering the news. But Alicia Lane she was on the news broadcast for CBS, but she was also in the media quite a bit. So she did a lot of reporting, in and outside of Philadelphia. And in the time leading up to when this case starts, which essentially is January of 2008, she was in a lot of gossip columns, both here in Philadelphia, as well as Page Six, the New York tabloids up in New York City. And so she was being talked about a lot, totally separate from her role as a news anchor with KYW. And this all kind of comes to a head in December of 2007 when she gets into what I'll describe as an altercation with a New York City police officer up in New York City, up in Manhattan, which brings felony charges for assaulting a police officer onto her as well. And so she gets suspended as the lead anchor as a result while some of these proceedings are taking place. And she is actually fired from or released from her contract from KYW on January 1st, 2008. And so what I thought I'd do is I would play an audio clip. And this is Larry Menti. So this is her co-anchor, but to be clear, this is the subject of our investigation at a time when he is conducting in the background criminal activity against the victim, Alicia Lane. But kind of interesting hearing the words from Menti himself from the January 8th, 2008, 11 o'clock news broadcast.
CBS 3 announced today that Alicia Lane has been released from her contract. Lane is facing a charge of assaulting a police officer in New York last month, a charge she categorically denies. CBS 3 President and General Manager Michael Colleran issued the following statement. It says, quote, "After assessing the overall impact of a series of incidents resulting from judgments she has made, we have concluded that it would be impossible for Alicia to continue to report the news, as she herself has become the focus of so many news stories. We wish to make it clear that we are not prejudging the outcome of the criminal case against Alicia that is pending in New York. We understand that Alicia expects to be fully vindicated in the proceeding. We hope that is the case, and we wish her the best in all her future endeavors."
And so that was read by Menti, again, our subject, January 8th, 2008, after she had been terminated from CBS. And this is a statement from president of CBS 3 here in Philadelphia, Michael Colleran. As I was mentioning, Elisa was in the news quite a bit. She had sent an email to a friend of hers who was an ESPN correspondent. That email contained some fairly racy bikini photos. That made the news. And then obviously her run-in with law enforcement up in New York City was widely reported in the news as well. But what had happened after she was released from CBS was a series of articles about her legal situation, primarily her criminal charges up in New York City. And details of that was appearing in the Philadelphia Daily News gossip column. That's a Philadelphia Daily News newspaper. Some of that information was public, but a lot of it was from some fairly obscure sources that a typical gossip columnist would not be able to pick up. And some of it was information that wasn't public at all. In particular, there are articles in mid-January that quote Paul Rosen, her Alicia Lane's attorney, talking about different aspects of her criminal case. There's information about Alicia potentially selling a Washington Square condo that she had. She had not even listed it yet, but there was information about who her real estate agent was. In particular, had information about her ex-husband in some of these newspaper articles that were being reported by Dan Gross, who was the gossip columnist in Philadelphia at the time. There was information in late January that she was planning to file a lawsuit against CBS for wrongful termination. There was information that her criminal dates up in Manhattan in February, that the dates of scheduled hearings were going to be changed, and had quotes from her criminal attorney, David Smith, about things that he was trying to do in terms of seeking an adjudication and contemplation of dismissal for her case. There was information in February being posted in the Daily News about where she was on vacation, the fact that she was in Phoenix, that she was writing a book. All this information was not public at all. It wasn't information that she had posted on social media. She later enacts the help of AFTRA. AFTRA is the union that represents media personalities in order to take on her case with her pending lawsuit against CBS for wrongful termination. Again, that's not information that would be public. That would have been information that came from potentially private confirmation from legal documents. There was information that would made its way into the news in March of 2008 about the amount of money the lawsuit was being valued out. So it was obvious that information was being leaked from somewhere and being leaked directly to the gossip column of the Philadelphia Daily News. And so that kind of brings us up to the March 2008 timeframe. And that's when Mike and Mike's office got a phone call from Alicia Lane's attorney, and that's when we get involved. So I'll let Mike kind of take the next part and talk a little bit about some of that initial contact with Paul Rosen, her attorney.
So Paul Rosen calls me somewhere in early March to tell me that they have reason to believe that someone is hacking into Alicia Lane's email accounts, and they have suspicions, and he'd like to show me what they've got. So I reach out to the cyber squad at the FBI and end up getting Brian assigned. Brian and I this may have been our first case together, Brian, wasn't it?
Certainly one of our early ones, yeah.
Yeah, because you had come to Philadelphia not too long before. So we make arrangements to meet Lane and Rosen in his office, which is not normal practice. Usually we tell people come into the FBI or come into to my office. But since Alicia Lane had been on television, I hope it's not too sexist to say she was a very good-looking woman, so people would recognize her if she came into either one of our buildings. So I opted to meet up at Rosen's office as a way of keeping things quiet so people wouldn't know that there was something going on. So Brian and I go up to Rosen's office. If I remember right, Alicia Lane is there. And what they tell us was they had suspected that Menti was getting into her email accounts, but just a few days earlier, one of Lane's friends at the station had sat down at the male anchor desk. When they had male and female anchors, at least at KYW, one was the male desk and one was the female desk. No broadcasting goes going on. She sits down at the desk and she just happens to brush her hand against a mouse and the screen wakes up. And when it wakes up, it is logged into Alicia Lane's Yahoo email account. Now, Lane had been fired on January 1st, and this is mid-March, so she wasn't getting any access to that. And the fact that it showed up on the male anchor desk computer was certainly a strong indication that somebody was doing it, and they strongly suspected that it was Larry Menti. So they gave us a number of the articles that Brian has talked about, and they gave us emails that went between Rosen and Lane, or Rosen and Lane and David Smith, the New York attorney, and showed us that the emails would be sent containing the information that appeared in the articles, and the articles would appear in the paper 1, 2, maybe 3 days later. Brian mentioned that the New York criminal lawyer was also in process of trying to negotiate what New York calls an adjournment in contemplation of dismissal. That's a pretrial probation program in which if the person doesn't get into any further trouble for some designated period of time, then the case is dismissed. And obviously, if you're a criminal defense lawyer, this is a good outcome for your client. Those are not easy cases to negotiate, particularly when the charge is assault on a police officer, because the prosecutor has got to deal not only with the defense lawyer, but also has to deal with the police department, who may be angry that the charges are going to be dismissed. So one of the things that they gave us was a letter. It was an anonymous letter that was sent to the DA's office in New York, addressed to the assistant DA who had the Alicia Lane case. And it contained a whole lot of information about, don't believe that Alicia Lane is doing public service, because apparently they were negotiating a deal where the DA wanted her to do some public service, and they were apparently pushing back that she does plenty of public appearances outside of the television station as part of her job at KYW. The other thing that was significant was the postmark on the envelope was from Philadelphia. Now, that's not a 100% guarantee, but it certainly was one further indication that the leak was coming out of Philadelphia.
The words that Larry Menti wrote about Alicia Lane exposes the jealousy, the pettiness, the vindictiveness he had for her. I have a copy. Let me read it. To the AD handling Alicia Lane's case. Do not fall for the claim that she does community service work all of the time. She only goes when the station forces her to, or when she knows she is going to be on TV. She has only made quick appearances of reported from charity or community events. Typo. She has never, ever helped out, got involved, or spent a significant amount of time on her own. And the time she spends is always with contributors or organizers, not with those who need help. She has never spent time with a child, helped the homeless, worked on a soup line, helped to put up a house, or chipped in at all. She needs to be assigned a duty and have a monitor log her in and out, or she won't do anything. She has been away from the station for a month and a half. If she is so involved with the community or with charities, ask her one thing she has gone to since leaving the station. I can assure you the answer is none. Even when she shows up, it is to mingle at a cocktail party. There are young Hispanic girls in North Philly who would love to spend time with Alicia at a police athletic league center. The PAL volunteers could monitor her time and make certain she doesn't spend the day talking on a cell phone. But you need to make it mandatory, a condition of the deal, and monitor or it will not happen. And if the community service is not directly connected to the incident, the NY officers look like fools. Alicia shouldn't mind spending time with young girls in North Philly, seeing as she claims she does this kind of stuff all the time. What a joke. You are dealing with a pathological liar.
Brian, is there anything you want to add at this point before I get into how we started?
No, I think go right into it, Mike, of what kind of the steps that we took. At this point, just to level set, there seemed to be an indication from Lane's camp and her attorney that Menti may have been involved. But at this point, as you know, we have to follow the actual evidence and we have to start building a case. So why don't you take it from there in terms of some of the initial legal steps we take?
Okay. Even before the legal steps, the first question was, do we open a file? There were some concerns that I had before I even opened a file. If someone's getting into Lane's email account, the odds are they're doing it because they know her username and her password. And so the easiest way to shut that down is to tell her to change her password. I was concerned because to the extent that he was logging in or someone was logging in from the CBS computer, knowing a little bit about large business computer networks, we were going to have a problem tying this to the particular computers at CBS. As many of your listeners may know, when you go on the internet, you're assigned an IP address, an Internet Protocol address. Big companies have a few of those, and then they use an internal addressing system where the company's router keeps track of which of the internal computers are using the network and knows how to send the traffic. So if we were going to have to trace it back to the particular computer at CBS, we were going to need the cooperation of CBS, even if it was only cooperating and complying with court orders. Jerry, you were the media contact for quite a few cases, so you know that newspapers and television stations are big defenders of the First Amendment. And if it's not on the air, if it's not in the newspaper, they don't want to give you any information. So one of my concerns was I getting into a big fight on the First Amendment? Another concern was this sounds like a dispute between two private people. And is this just a sandbox fight we're going to get the government into the middle of? Those often don't turn out well for the government.
I would also think that you were thinking about the fact that she was suing CBS. So you're almost working as part of her civil case, knowing that she would probably use some of that information in her claims against them.
Correct. That's part of the whole, what am I getting us in the middle of when there's a perfectly good remedies in the civil courts? But a couple of things tipped in favor of proceeding. One, the information that was getting leaked was attorney-client information. It was confidential communications between a client and an attorney. And I thought that would weigh heavily with a judge if we charged this case, that judges would take more seriously the idea that it was attorney-client information that was being leaked. And the second thing that tipped it was these leaks could have ended any negotiations for the pretrial probation program in New York, and that could have exposed Lane to a criminal conviction. And so I decided, let's at least get started and see what we can find. So the first thing I did was Lane had two email accounts, one at Yahoo and one with Apple. Back then it was a .Mac account. Now they're iCloud accounts. So I issued a grand jury subpoena for access logs to those accounts from the firing date of January 1, 2008 to the date of the subpoena, which would have been sometime in March. And a few weeks later, we got responses both from Yahoo and from Apple. And they showed a couple of things. One, there were access to the accounts from a Comcast Internet Protocol address, which when we traced that back, that came to Alicia Lane's residence. So that was no surprise. There were some access from CBS, which we also anticipated. But much to our surprise, we found a IP address that belonged to Verizon, and that didn't match up with either Lane or CBS. And so the next step was to issue a subpoena to Verizon to ask who had that IP address on the date and time or dates and times that access was made to Lane's accounts. And kind of to our, I'm not sure the surprise was the right word, but we found out the Verizon response came back to Larry Mente's home. So while he was home, living with his wife, he was accessing Lane's email accounts. So with that, we went to the next step, which was I got a court order for what's called a pen register trap and trace order. These terms go way back to the dial-up telephone days. A pen register captured the dialed telephone numbers, and a trap and trace captured the number from which an incoming call came. In the internet age, this order gets you the internet protocol addresses on the to and from lines. And so we asked for all the IP addresses logging into Lane's account and let it run for 60 days. In the meantime, Brian gave instructions to Alicia Lane to continuing using the accounts for innocuous purposes, not for anything related to attorney-client, just so it would look like things were going on. And then I remember specifically Brian giving instructions to Alicia Lane to email some images, some pictures when she sent emails. And Brian, I'll let you explain why you did that.
Sure. It's, Mike's description of some of the technical details. Cyber cases are challenging, and all credit to AUSAs like Mike, who are always thinking about being in the courtroom presenting a case to a jury. Because I think as FBI agents and investigators, we're very eager to go and issue legal process and build a case, and I've certainly been guilty of not thinking of how it will look in the courtroom later in front of a jury. But Mike thinking about things of First Amendment concerns, and whether or not to your point, Jerry, that the victim might then use our case to build a civil lawsuit. So working with your partner prosecutor who's thinking about these things and keeping you as an eager investigator in check is really important. But as Mike said, we get these subpoena returns that come back. The one that comes back to CBS is still kind of a question mark, because as Mike was saying, we just know it came from CBS. We don't have video of someone's hands on a keyboard, which when you're working a cyber case, that's ultimately your goal, is to put someone's hand on the keyboard to know who committed the crime, who did the access. But then, we got this Verizon IP back. And yeah, as Mike said, it kind of no surprise, we were expecting to see Larry Mente's name on that. We worked closely with Alicia Lane during this time to make it appear that we're not conducting our investigation, at least to someone who's accessing the email account.
So she didn't change her password. She left it so he could still access it.
Correct. And that was a bit of strategy on our part. We ensured that she was not putting information in those accounts after our involvement that she would not want made public, because quite frankly, things that were being put in those accounts were still being leaked to a gossip columnist. And so, they were fairly innocuous things. Mike referred to images. It was obvious as we were building this case that there was a bit of I guess I'll term it fascination that Larry Mente had. And maybe that's putting it mildly, but fascination, I think, is the word that comes to mind, that he had for his co-anchor. And so the fact that she put some images, innocuous enough images, in the account, we figured at some point, I was also the FBI calls a CART forensic examiner, in addition to a special agent. So I knew I was thinking, as I developed my cases, thinking of the forensics later of what I would be able to tie to a subject's computer. And so, the more things we put in the account that we knew a subject was accessing, the more what we call digital artifacts we would have on the back end to review. And again, for jury appeal, be able to show, Alicia Lane sends an email with this picture attached to it to a friend on the West Coast. And wow, that same image, kind of sole source, winds up in forensics that we would do in an offender. So as Mike said, we got the pen register trap and trace kind of real time monitoring. So this is starting to get fairly high tech in terms of the reports that we were getting. Back in 2008, things were a little different than they are today. Apple didn't provide real time access to the accounts that Yahoo did, but Apple still sent us, I think, on a daily basis, a summary of accesses to these accounts. And when we say that, Menti was accessing these accounts, I can't put enough of an emphasis on the fact that he was accessing these accounts many times a day. He was accessing them from not only his home, a very nice property, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a bit, up in Chestnut Hill section of Philadelphia, which, if you know Philadelphia, is a kind of a nice address to live at. Accessing from there, likely the one accessing from CBS, although we didn't have, certainly the evidence of that at the time. We saw accesses from a beach property down on the Jersey Shore, which came back to Menti. And we also saw access from the Union League in Philadelphia, which is a club in Philadelphia that Menti was a member of. And to kind of put some logistics in, Menti would do the 6 o'clock news broadcast. He'd be off the air at 6:30, and then he had downtime. If he wasn't doing a guest appearance somewhere before the 11 o'clock broadcast, he would zip over across town from one side of the Vine Street Expressway to the other on South Broad Street, over to the Union League, have a nice dinner. But also they had internet terminals, a little internet cafe within the Union League, which he would access and log into Alicia Lane's email accounts. And so we saw these accesses occurring, not just in different locations, but they were fairly constant, including some interesting accesses to her account from CBS between the hours of 11 and 11:30. Remember where Larry Menti is at that moment. He is sitting at the anchor desk.
Oh my goodness.
And Mike was kind of painting the picture of the male anchor desk, the female anchor desk. That's what they had back then. And what you don't see on the news when you and I watch it on TV is there's a flat desk, but it's a transparent screen that they can look down and they can see, not a teleprompter because that's in front of them as they read the news, but they have a PC computer that they can access right there at the desk. So this is the computer that Mike had mentioned another news colleague had bumped and woken up in the March timeframe, likely in the hours after Larry Menti had been sitting at the anchor desk, potentially on a commercial break, logging into Alicia Lane's email account. That's how persistent he was with accessing Alicia Lane's email, that he was doing it while he was at work, certainly, but not just at work, but while he was in the middle of a news broadcast.
Very bold.
Bold is an interesting word. I think he was extremely bold. And like I said, there was some fascination, I think, with the information that he was seeing in her account. We'll talk maybe towards the end a little bit about what we believe some of his motivations for doing this were.
I can't wait to hear that because he's already gotten her fired. So, you would assume that this initially might have been a jealousy thing. Let's just get rid of her.
Yeah.
But she's gone and he's still accessing her email.
I think he wanted to make sure she stayed fired. I think he was a bit threatened. And again, we'll kind of cover motivations, but I think he wanted to make sure that if he had any hand in her firing, that he made sure that it stayed that way. This is one of those cases, as an investigator, you work up a case, you finally find who your subject is by doing some legal process. And now you got to, potentially do some surveillance to kind of put pieces together. This is really one of the first, had a couple cases that have involved people of some celebrity. This was certainly the first. Doing surveillance on a news anchor can be pretty easy, it turns out. He had a pretty predictable pattern. We obviously had a home address up in a section of Philadelphia. We knew what time he would kind of come into the station. We knew that between the 6 o'clock broadcast and the 11 o'clock broadcast, that with pretty great regularity, he would go across town to the Union League. So not exactly a huge challenge. We didn't need air support or an SOG special ops team carrying the city in order to track him. It was kind of easy to know his comings and goings in terms of where he would be. But I'll kind of turn it over to Mike, talk about some of the probable cause of what we had to move forward with the search.
So it's time to pay back the compliment. One of the fun things I always found about working with good agents was how an assistant who's thinking about the courtroom and an agent who's thinking about the investigation can really team up and complement one another in how the case gets done. So, we knew that we gathered the IP addresses. I would never have thought about telling Lane to send some pictures because if Menti downloaded them, they were going to show up on his computer. But Brian was already thinking about the takedown and the search. And of course, from a courtroom point of view, if you have pictures that Lane says, I sent this to one person, I didn't send it to Menti. There's only one way it would have gotten on his computer, and that's if he had been getting into her account. One other thing, just to follow up with what Brian said, we were getting real time, but at least back then, Apple, who had just come out with the iPhone, couldn't give us a real time pen register trap and trace. But every day, somewhere in early afternoon, I would get an email that contained the logs for the previous day. The benefit we got out of that, though, was one of the things Apple was tracking with each login was the total number of emails that had been read. And the crime we were thinking of charging was unauthorized access to a protected computer, which contains as one of its elements that the person thereby gains information. Well, having proof that the individual opened 5 or 6 emails certainly made that element of the crime a whole lot easier to prove. So at this point, we now have the pen registers run for 60 days. We have hundreds of accesses, either from CBS or from Menti's home or the Union League or his place down the Jersey Shore. And so we put together a search warrant, and the point will be to execute a search warrant on Menti's home for evidence, including searching his computers, and at the same time to serve a court order on CBS to identify which internal computers were accessing the Lane accounts. So the probable cause is pretty straightforward. We had logins to Lane accounts from the Menti residence. We had them at his vacation house in Ocean City, New Jersey. From the Union League, we have them when he's on the air. So we just lay all that out and say we want to look at his home computer. It's one of the computers that was looked at. The other thing we want to get is the court order to CBS, and the statute there doesn't use the term probable cause, but it uses something pretty close, which is that we had to show specific and articulable facts that the information we were seeking was relevant and material to an ongoing criminal investigation. So basically, the applications look very similar because all the facts were in there were the same. But I did something a little unusual on this one. When I got the court order, when I went to the magistrate to get it, I had the order sealed, which was the normal thing we would do so you didn't leak the investigation. But I got the judge to give me permission to disclose the facts of the application to the attorneys for CBS and to the upper management at CBS, because I felt pretty strongly that if they saw what was going on, that one of their computers was being used to hack into the email account of one of their former anchors, a lot of their First Amendment concerns would disappear.
What do you mean? If you could explain that a little bit.
They would realize, no, they're not trying to get into our sources. They're not trying to, find out how we put this story together. They're really doing a criminal investigation of one of our people. And the evidence is really on our computers, and that's all they're really looking for.
Oh, okay. Just to alleviate their fears about the direction of the investigation.
Exactly. Brian, why don't I turn it over to you to talk about the execution of the search warrant? And when you finished with that, I'll talk about how your supervisor at the time, John Brosnan, and I served the court order on CBS.
This was one of those cases where I remember saying, wow, this was pretty straightforward. We had subject identified inside of a week to 10 days. As I mentioned, surveillance of the subject established very predictable patterns. Although I will add one thing I just recalled, which is that the street he lived on up in Chestnut Hill was a one-way street. And for those investigators, if you've ever had to do surveillance on a one-way street in a really nice neighborhood, that's not really an easy thing to do. You can't sit without a nosy neighbor wanting to know what you're doing there. And again, you can't kind of do a U-turn at the other end of the street. You got to kind of go around out of the neighborhood, back into the neighborhood. And this house, I painted a picture of a fairly nice house, nice property with a high iron fence around it with a gate. And as we were preparing for the search warrant, I remember talking to my partner on the cyber squad about well, gosh, we're going to come like we do with every search warrant at 6 a.m. And how are we going to get in this gate? We're very sensitive. Mike's going to talk about serving a search warrant on CBS News. And so we're sensitive to the fact that we're going to be executing a search warrant on someone who not only is a journalist, but is a celebrity here in Philadelphia, and the likely media coverage that it's going to get. And so I'm trying to think of, gosh, we don't want to bring a ram vehicle and have to ram through a gate. And then there's pictures of an iron gate turned upside down and whatnot. But with the FBI, we plan all of our search warrants with a show of force, and we do it safe, and we have numbers of highly trained people that will come in to make sure our scene is safe for both law enforcement and the people in the house. And so we couldn't just kind of pull up on the road and shout from the road, "Hey, open the gate, we're here with a search warrant." You go to the front door and you knock and announce. And in order to get to that front door, we were trying to figure out, well, how do we get to the front door if there's a gate around the property? And so without getting into tactics and techniques, we had a plan for that to get in the gate if we needed it. But lo and behold, the day that we pull up for the search warrant, the gate's wide open. All the surveillance that we had done, all the spot checks we had done, the gate was always closed. It was going to be an issue. But the date that we actually come to serve the search warrant, it's wide open, and we can kind of just waltz right in. And so we move forward now to the actual search. I will say in general that, we knock and announce like we do any search warrant. Menti was home with his wife. I should note his wife, and I believe they're married today, is Dawn Stensland. People in the Philly area may recognize that name. Awkwardly at the time, she was the Fox News anchor here in the Philadelphia market, while her husband Larry was the CBS News anchor. She no longer anchors the news here. I believe every once in a while I hear her still on WPHL talk radio. So I believe she and Larry are still somewhere in the area. Every once in a while he's on the news doing something, not something like this, but you see him from time to time. They were home with their young son. And so like every search warrant, we go in, we secure the property, make sure our scene is safe, and we start our search warrant execution. I will say that Menti and Ms. Stensland were very cooperative with us. As law enforcement, you always don't get cooperation when you're executing a search warrant sometimes, but for the most part, they were very cooperative. We went through the house, obviously looking for things in our attachment to the search warrant that we were able to get. And we seized a number of different things. We obtained printed email messages from Alicia Lane's KYW email account that were found in Larry Menti's home office, some dating back as far as early June of 2006. This is almost 2 years prior to when we're executing the search warrant. Printed email addresses from Alicia Lane's Yahoo email account, also dated back several years prior, between her and her husband. So just picture this. These are email communications between, a victim and their spouse that are sitting in this third person's home office. Content of several of her email messages going back several years. Her passwords to her Yahoo and her .Mac accounts were written down. So bad cybersecurity, never write your passwords down on a sticky note and put them on your monitor. But that's where we found Alicia Lane's passwords to her 2 email accounts in Larry Menti's home, in his home office. Later on, the forensics that were done on the computers we seized from his residence would show internet history files showing his access to Lane's accounts, which then corresponded to information that we kind of married up later with the grand jury subpoenas and the pen register that we had done. We were very careful, I'll also note, in the forensics because, and Mike's going to talk briefly about Privacy Protection Act and the concerns there, but we were very mindful that we were conducting a search of a journalist's computer. And so we had to be careful of, making sure the information that we were looking through was obviously relevant to this investigation.
And how did you do that? Did you have a third party?
I don't recall us having a third party, and I don't think it was as formal as what we refer to, I think, as a taint team. But I do know that we had multiple people available. I think even on my squad, we carved up my responsibilities with another case agent from the cyber squad so that if we had information to review, it would be reviewed by somebody that was not involved in the what we call the 288 investigation, the computer access investigation. So I think on the back end, we just made sure we were able to separate duties and make sure that if we did come across any works in progress, meaning journalistic works, we could kind of carve them out and not have them involved in this part of the investigation. So it just took a little bit of extra care and handling of how we handled the forensics. We did find, going back to those picture files, we did find pictures from Lane's email accounts. We also found the famous or infamous bikini photos. These were the photos that Alicia had sent probably back in the 2006 or 7 timeframe to Rich Eisen, the ESPN anchor, that were found by Susie Schuster, his wife. And that was a scandal back then. Those pictures were on Larry Mente's computer, having been accessed through her email account. And those images, interesting enough, going to the forensics and the inner geek in me with regard to the ones and zeros of these investigations, we were able to show file access to those bikini photos occurring as recently as May 24th, 2008, which is about 5 days prior to the execution of the search warrant by the FBI. So it showed not only did Mente grab those photos out of Alicia Lane's email account by unauthorized access to her account using her password, but he was viewing those pictures probably on a regular basis, but as recently as a few days before our search of his residence. There were some other files. Larry Mente, had taken a bunch of the emails and kind of put them together into a WordPerfect document. And they were kind of a hodgepodge of communications that she had with other anchors, someone that she would have been dating at the time, emails back and forth between Alicia Lane and Susie Schuster, the wife of the ESPN anchor Rich Eisen as well. And then we found some of the legal documents. Mike said early on that our decision to proceed in this case had a lot to do with the fact that attorney-client privileged communications essentially were being published. And we found PDF files of the notice of claim filed by Lane's attorney against the city of New York. There was text from a book which Lane was writing in the late 2007, early 2008 timeframe. And she had emailed copies to herself as a way to kind of back that up. She was writing an article as well, which Mente had on his computer as well. So with that, I'll turn it over to Mike to talk about a parallel process while the cyber squad and others from the FBI were on the ground in the house up in Chestnut Hill, part of Philadelphia. Mike and the cyber supervisor, a legend in the Bureau, John Brosnan, who was my supervisor at the time of the cyber squad, was with Mike and the folks at CBS. So I'll let Mike fill us in on that part.
Thanks, Brian. I've got to deflate some expectations here. You've talked about the bikini photos, and I kept hearing about them and thinking, oh boy, I can't wait to see these. You finally find them on the computer and you show them to me. And it's a picture of Lane and a couple of her girlfriends on the beach somewhere in New Jersey. And my reaction is, anytime in the summer, I could walk down the beach and see a scene like this. It was nothing like the buildup.
Right. But definitely something, as you said, Larry accessed on a frequent basis. So he found them quite fetching.
She was an attractive woman.
And she was. I would agree.
So Brian talked about the Privacy Protection Act, and just a quick little bit about that. There's a statute that limits the ability of the government to search for both the things journalists are writing and their work product as they're developing it. It's a case that goes way back to the early 70s. Some of your listeners may be old enough to remember at the late part of the Vietnam War, there was an incursion into Cambodia that caused a lot of anger and demonstrations in the United States. Actually, one of them was at Kent State, and probably most people know the iconic photo of that. But another one occurred at Stanford University. And it was a huge demonstration there that got pretty unruly, ended up with police arresting people assaulting police officers. And the police department didn't arrest everybody on that scene, obviously. And so they wanted to see if they could identify any of the people who had assaulted police officers. So they executed a search warrant on the Stanford Daily, which was the college newspaper. to get any photographs that they had. And they never got anything. But the Stanford Daily sued the chief of police, claiming that there was a violation of the First Amendment for them to search. And since they weren't a suspect, there was no basis to search them. Well, on the second part, the Supreme Court said, no, the issue on a search warrant is not whether the person whose premises are being searched is a suspect. The only issue is there reason to believe that there's evidence of a crime that can be found in there? They also said there was no special First Amendment protection for newspapers. Congress responded to that in 1978 by passing the Privacy Protection Act. The purpose was to make it so that law enforcement could not get work product of journalists. That made a lot of sense in 1978. In this day of internet media, everybody's a publisher. So it makes it a whole lot harder. But the Lane case was simple because both Menti and his wife were traditional journalists. And so one of the things I had to do was get permission from the Justice Department to execute the search warrant, which we did. So the search Brian's talked about, that happened May 29, 2008. Nice because it was the end of May. It's late out in the morning because Brian was prepared to execute the warrant at 6 o'clock in the morning. And I was sitting with John Brosnan down in Center City, Philadelphia, a block away from the headquarters of KYW, because Alicia Lane had told us that Michael Colleran, the head of the station, was usually in before 6 a.m. So John Brosnan and I sat there waiting for a call from Brian. And once Brian called and said they had made entry into the house and the place was secure, John and I got out of the car and walked up the street and walked into KYW's offices. There's practically nobody there at that hour. And there's a security guard on the door, and he asks, "Gentlemen, can I help you?" We both take out our credentials. John's are much more impressive. And we tell him we're there to see Michael Colleran. He calls Colleran. We get sent right up, and we sit down and talk to him, and we clearly ruined his day. He knew he was having problems between Alicia Lane and Menti, and he thought when he fired Lane back in January, those were all over. And here we were 5 months later, raining on his parade. But he was a perfect gentleman. So we served him with the order, and he then turned it over, obviously, to their lawyers. And within 24 hours, I get a call from the CBS attorneys in New York. And I say, look, I can, they want to know what this is about. They got First Amendment issues. I said, look, I have permission to send you the underlying application. You've got to keep it confidential. But with that understanding, I will email it off to you. So I email it off. And by early in the next week, I had a call confirming that the access to Lane's accounts had either come from the Mail Anchor News Desk or from Menti's office at CBS, and they sent us the documents to follow up right away. So we ended up charging Menti with, as I said, with unauthorized access to a protected computer. Jerry, you have the information if you want to post it on your website. But one of the concerns I had was kind of the public relations impact of this case is, are people going to say, well, he was getting it to her email account. Well, so what? What's the big deal? And so the information goes on for page after page, just listing each access. It was an information because he had agreed to plead guilty, which is fortunate because otherwise each one would have had to been a separate count of the indictment. But I did that basically to show, as Brian said, he was accessing her account multiple times a day. He accessed her accounts more than probably the three of us access our email accounts combined each day. And so it really got across in a document the obsession that Menti had. He ended up pleading guilty. He was sentenced to 6 months of house arrest, 3 years probation, a fine, no contact order with Miss Lane, and computer monitoring, which I think we were pretty satisfied with. It's a computer intrusion case, but it did not involve any destruction of any computer equipment. He had harmed Lane, but the penalty that he got was much more severe than the 6 months house arrest. He was fired by CBS. He was making more than $500,000 a year, and suddenly he was out of work. I don't think he could afford that nice house in Chestnut Hill. As a result, his career plummeted. I mean, he's still around, but he never got back to where he had been, which had been pretty much on top of the world.
And the same, I would take it for Alicia, too. He basically ruined her career for her, too.
He certainly influenced it to go potentially in a different direction. I'm certain that had this not happened with her in Philadelphia, understand she was not an angel outside of the newsroom. And so maybe the things that were happening in her personal life would have directed what happened next. But she was, very popular at CBS 3, KYW in Philadelphia. Essentially, that's the some of the motivation that Menti had indicated was that, she was new, she was young, she was going to start to make more money than he was. And frankly, as I forget how old he was at the time, but as an older person, these jobs reporting the news are typically people who are young and look nice. And he was getting older and felt threatened, I think, by Alicia Lane. And so that off-screen kind of animosity between the two of them that even the president of CBS3, Michael Colleran, indicated he had been aware of the kind of feuding that was happening in the months leading up to eventually her termination. It was really the motivation. He wanted to make sure that she wasn't there to take his job. And then even after she was fired January 1, he wanted to make sure she wasn't going to come back. He was reading that she was launching a lawsuit against CBS for wrongful termination. And he was fearful that she potentially might get her job back. And so he wanted to ensure he was going to keep getting access to information, keep leaking it to the Daily News reporter, and keep trying to ensure her criminal case up in New York City was going to result in some real charges that would somehow, either incarcerate her or certainly ensure she wasn't going to come back into the news desk and threaten him anymore.
As far as the information, does it talk about you getting evidence from Dan Gross? Again, for this First Amendment right, is the Daily News reporter able to refuse to cooperate because of that?
Way deep in the information, one of the things we did was to show Menti accesses a particular email of Lane. His cell phone records reveal shortly thereafter a call to Dan Gross, and then a day or two later, the contents of that email appearing in the Daily News. Menti was a source of Dan Gross, and so he was not going to give up his source. And I was going to be hard-pressed to come up with arguments why I needed that, particularly since I had the cell phone records. And so we didn't ask him.
I doubt we would have gotten any cooperation from the Daily News or that reporter. And again, wanting to make sure we kept our investigation close hold until it wasn't anymore to ensure, we controlled the narrative as best we can. Going back to Alicia Lane a bit, she's fired from KYW January 1st, 2008. She does not get her job back from KYW. She does have a lawsuit that eventually, 5 and 6 years later, was still winding its way through the court systems there in Philadelphia. But she does move out to LA, maybe an idea to get a kind of a fresh start on the West Coast. 2009, she gets hired by the NBC affiliate in Los Angeles, KNBC, and she's an on-air reporter for NBC Los Angeles until about the 2013 timeframe. That's really the last I heard of her in the news business. And I checked before we did the podcast. I haven't really seen any place else that she's been hired or reporting from. It's reported that she's remarried and has a child. So maybe just kind of moving on with her life. But Jerry, to your point, he certainly, Larry Menti's release of a lot of personal information, certainly I'm sure had an impact on her career here in Philadelphia, certainly, and maybe outside of her profession as well.
I can tell you, I looked it up myself, and there was an article in the Enquirer that the suit was settled in January of 2017. So you're right, many years after he pled guilty in 2008. The title of the news article is "To Settle Suit, Larry Mente Apologizes for Ruining Alicia Lane's Life." So others believe that he had a hand in her not shooting up into the national spotlight.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, certainly, the fact that 7 years later and he had still not apologized. I do recall, and Mike, I don't know if you remember the details of this, that several days after, I guess maybe he accepted his plea, or maybe it was the day he accepted his plea, he held a press conference. Certainly, if you search for it, I don't know where it was, probably his attorney's office, but he held a press conference. And because he was Larry Menti and a well-known, news celebrity in the city, it was widely attended. Every news agency was there. There was the bank of cameras and microphones. And once again, he kind of had the spotlight. And he made a statement, was very contrite, in particular with respect to his spouse, Dawn Stensland, and what he kind of put her through. But I don't recall, and I'm fairly certain in that news conference he held, there was no apology towards his victim then. And it took, like Jerry just mentioned, several years until the civil case kind of ran its course over years and years before he actually issued a formal apologies to her.
You both were telling me that you use this case as a teaching tool, Mike to law students and Brian to investigators. Could you kind of sum up some of the teachable moments that this case brought forth for you and why it's one of the ones that you include in your curriculum?
Go ahead, Mike.
So I've been teaching a cybercrime seminar at Penn Law School since about 2005 now. And the course covers substantive crimes, which is computer intrusions and computer damage like hacking and denial of service. But it also covers older crimes that are now committed in new ways using computers. So we talk about child sexual exploitation, theft of intellectual property, threats. And a good half of the semester is spent going over the law of evidence gathering when your evidence is in digital format. And so I spent 2 weeks on just the law regarding the search of the computer, what we did in the Menti case. And then I spend a week on things that are covered by what's called the Stored Communications Act, which is what allows us to get pen registers and search warrants on internet accounts like the Yahoo and the Apple accounts that we were investigating in this case. And so the techniques that we used, the search warrant for a physical computer, the pen register, the court order to obtain records from CBS, all fit into things I've taught the students about. Here is the law. Here are the rules. A case like this kind of flips the problem 90 degrees as opposed to, when I'm going to teach you the law, it's going to be, let's take a problem and see how we use these tools to conduct an investigation to get to the end point that we're trying to get to. And so a case like this just fits that really well.
When I was in the FBI, I was a police instructor, and also I taught a number of cybercrime classes, both here domestically and overseas. I was also based overseas for a couple of years as an assistant legal attaché in Frankfurt, Germany. And this case is kind of ready-made to kind of do a cyber 101 with it. You know, you talk about establishing what the crime was and then laying out the steps that you take in a cybercrime case with respect to, knowing that an IP address is, it's like a license plate. It identifies a unique thing within the internet. So I've used this case to kind of teach cyber classes to investigators, but I've also used this same case in my teaching. I'm an adjunct professor at Westchester University since 2002. And certainly since this case, I've been using the course, a traditional 14-week semester for criminal justice students is broken down. In the first third, we kind of talk about types of cyber crimes, of which computer intrusion is, one of the main types that's highlighted. The middle third of the course talks all about the law, things like Fourth Amendment, which applies to search and seizure of digital devices. And then the final third of the course is kind of a review of digital evidence and a kind of a capstone of how you work a case kind of from start to finish. And I've been, fortunate. Mike's had me come to his law school class at Penn and guest lecture and cover this course. And I've reciprocated with Mike coming out to my class at Westchester when I'm in the middle part talking about constitutional implications in cybercrime and, First Amendment, Fourth Amendment, Fifth Amendment types of things. And so this case lends itself nicely to, okay, you have an IP address. Now what do you do? Well, now you issue a subpoena and you wait for that to come back, and then you follow the trail that way. And because you have something that's ongoing, not just in the past, a pen register trap and trace order can kind of give you real-time information as to what your subject is doing and how they're doing it, and then to be able to highlight at the end the forensics that we do on a computer that's seized and be able to tie that to information that the victim had, well, and now your subject has it. So how does that happen? And kind of showing, again, thinking of being in front of a jury at some point, of the jury appeal that would have of demonstrating a digital artifact that winds up being on a subject's computer system. Certainly a lot of my students want to ask and see the bikini photos, and that's not part of the presentation that I give in the class, but it lays out a very great timeline of how this case kind of evolved over time.
Perfect. I mean, this case was really a good example of the partnership between a federal investigator and a federal prosecutor. So I really appreciate you reviewing this case for us today. What percentage would you say of cases in the U.S. Attorney's Office, especially when it comes to kind of a white-collar crime type cases, you receive pleas, and how many would go to trial?
The numbers were generally at least 90% were guilty pleas. And I think I've been out now 6 years, but that number I think is holding pretty steady over the years. I mean, one of the things that you had as a federal prosecutor was good law enforcement agents. And so when you charged a case, it was pretty darn strong. Now, there may be cases where they're defensible, and there may be cases where the penalty is big enough that the person will take the chance and go to trial, or even if the sentence isn't so big, the risk of losing a career or a license or something like that may cause someone to go to trial. But for the most part, the evidence is so strong because of the agencies have done such a good job gathering evidence that a substantial number plead guilty.
I'll share a tactic of Mike Levy's that I've known from working cases with him is to the point he just made about the abundance of evidence that drives towards a guilty plea versus a decision by counsel to take a chance in trial. This case of Larry Menti was a perfect example of that. All that evidence that we gathered, and I think the information, the indictment talks about 500 accesses of Menti to Alicia Lane's accounts. We took a lot of that evidence and papered an entire FBI conference room table with all the evidence that we had gathered throughout the case, so that when it comes time to sit down with the defendant and their counsel and talk about, okay, what's next? Are we going to move towards accepting of a guilty plea? That kind of overwhelming feeling that, having worked with Mike, that defendant feels when they walk into that room to see everything that law enforcement and the prosecutor have put together, that they're fully ready to take into a courtroom for a trial, is what's going to be presented against them. I think that helps push that number towards that 90% taking the guilty plea.
The abundance of evidence.
Yep. I would call up defense counsel and say, why don't you come down and take a look at what we have? And if you want to bring your client, I'm not going to ask him any questions. Just have him come see what we have, and then you can decide what you want to do. That was often very persuasive.
I can imagine. Well, the only reason I said that is because I know people would be interested also in having a retired agent and a retired AUSA come and talk about a case that did go to trial, and we can talk about the differences and the prep and all of that. So I'm putting that message out there because I got my wish, but, I'm never satisfied. So, if there's another case that we can explore, I'd love to do that too.
Let me give some thought. I may have some ideas.
Okay, great.
I never had the pleasure to take one of my cases to trial with Mike, but I have had the pleasure of witnessing Mike in his best form, which is in the courtroom with a jury in front of him in other cases, in particular, some of the child exploitation cases that he tried. And it's just, it was always a pleasure to kind of sit and watch him present information in such a compelling way. And again, when you're talking about these cases, cybercrime, and even the child exploitation cases can be very technical. To have someone like Mike who is articulate at being able to explain what an IP address is, what a MAC address is, how the internet works. I mean, those are not easy concepts to have people understand, but his skill as a litigator in the courtroom in being able to convey that information, certainly a part of his success in the courtroom.
All right, so we are at the part of the episode where I get to learn about your origin story. So I have to ask my standard question. Brian, when and why did you join the FBI?
Yeah, it's a great question, Jerry. I think like many of your listeners, I grew up reading Hardy Boys mystery books and watching Scooby-Doo. So that sense of solving a mystery was just something that was kind of always something that I strived for. And as a teenager, I became an EMT. And so I took that working on ambulances into when I went to college. And so that dedication to serve was just something that kind of always drove me. And then, frankly, it came to 9/11. In 2001, I was working out in Silicon Valley in the tech sector, and 9/11 happened. And to me, that was the call to service that I needed to kind of pivot from working in industry and tech to one of public service. Just almost a year later, after 9/11, I was sitting in a new agents class in Quantico. And so that started my 20 years working in the FBI. So I do always go back to the Hardy Boys and Scooby-Doo, though. Just that desire to kind of solve a mystery is something that's always driven me forward.
Did you know any FBI agents?
I knew I wanted to be an FBI agent when I was about 10 years old. and actually wrote a letter to the then SSRA of the Paramus, New Jersey RA, which is no longer there. It's up in Garrett Mountain now. And an agent by the name of Tom Farley, I'm sure long retired from the Bureau, definitely, was kind enough to invite a friend and I at probably 10, maybe 11 years old to tour the RA, which, if you've been to most RA offices, they don't look particularly fancy. They're office spaces, but that definitely set a memory with me at an early age that I wanted to be in the FBI. And then probably when I was 15 or 16, wrote letter to the FBI headquarters expressing my interest to be an agent. So yeah, I knew I wanted to be an agent since I was a young kid. And then when 9/11 happened, did reach out and talk to some agents in the Philadelphia office who I think were instrumental in informing my decision to apply and come on board.
Fantastic. And Mike, what about you? When and why did you decide to become a federal prosecutor and join the U.S. Attorney's Office?
It goes back to 1979. I'd been an attorney for 10 years. I started out as a public defender. I did that for about 3 years and then went to the Philadelphia District Attorney's Office and was there for a couple of years and was then out in private practice for about 3-4 years. And my two partners had left. So I was a sole practitioner and not enjoying it. And I was thinking of going back and being a prosecutor again. And I talked to the district attorney then, Edward Rendell, who I'd worked for before, and he suggested maybe applying to the U.S. Attorney's Office. So I did that. Ed made a phone call to Peter Vieira, who was then the U.S. Attorney. Peter brought me in for an interview, and in amazingly fast time, had my interview in November and started in January, which is almost unheard of. And when I got there, it was like everything I'd done for the previous 10 years all fell into place. Everything just seemed to have been training me for doing this job. And I just fell in love with the work. I left 2 times to go into private practice, both because I thought maybe I should make more money, support my young family, and I didn't like it. And so in 1990, I came back for the second time, knowing that I was a lifer, that this was my calling. This is what I wanted to do. The money was okay. We could live on it. And it gave me more satisfaction than any other job I'd ever had. And when I came back, I knew there were no what ifs. I've tried all the other options, and this is what I want to do.
Now you're both retired. So what are you doing now?
I'll go first. So I retired from the FBI at the end of 2022 and immediately went to work for Children's Hospital in Philadelphia. So CHOP, if you're from Philadelphia, it's referred to as CHOP. And my background is technical. I worked in tech in Silicon Valley before I came into the FBI and then spent 20 years working crimes against children and technical cybercrime cases in the FBI. And so when I left the Bureau, I went to Children's Hospital as their Senior Director of Information Security and did that for just shy of 2 years, helping to defend all of the onslaught of cyber attacks on a global pediatric brand. Certainly no shortage of work there with the amount and seriousness of which healthcare is seeing attacks. We don't turn on the news these days without seeing another hack or data leak of information from the healthcare system. But then last summer, I had an opportunity to get back to something I'm passionate about. One of the last things I did in the FBI was ASAC, Assistant Special Agent in Charge in Philadelphia. But right before that, I was a chief down in the Violent Crimes Against Children section at FBI headquarters. Felt really strongly about those cases and the people that work those. And so I'm now with an organization called Thorn. And so Thorn is a small technology nonprofit that develops solutions for the front lines to address the child sexual abuse material that's on the internet. And so we have a kind of a dual revenue mission that's also driven by philanthropy, where we create products and solutions for the tech industry to keep child abuse material off of social platforms. But then we also work with the front lines of law enforcement, which is the area that I lead up, in order to create solutions to kind of what we call shrink the haystack, or the needle in the haystack problem of the large volume of child abuse material that exists on the internet in these cases. Some of the tools we have kind of shrinks that haystack down and makes it easier for investigators to do victim identification work. So it's a chance for me in my retirement to get back, work still with law enforcement on a crime problem that I feel strongly about.
And Mike?
Well, I retired from the U.S. Attorney's Office in 2019. I was one of those guys who was afraid to retire. I finally retired at the age of 75, not because I was running out of steam, but I knew that someday I would, and I didn't want to have them come and throw me out. And I'd been teaching cybercrime at Penn, and around that same time, they asked me if I would also teach evidence. Evidence has been kind of intermittent. The fifth time will be this coming fall. And I've taught cybercrime every year. For me, it's just a great retirement job. It's not as stressful as being in the courtroom. It keeps my mind challenged, keeps me off the streets and out of trouble. And I like teaching young people. And so I'm still going on doing that.
I like to give my guest the last word. Mike, what would you like to say?
This case was a lot of fun. It went kind of the way we hoped it would go. It was, I think, my first case of working with Brian. Tell one story out of school. Brian had worked in Buffalo before he came to Philadelphia and did a lot of work with an assistant U.S. attorney up there by the name of Marty Littlefield. And I knew Marty from conferences around the country. And he called me up one day and said, I understand that Brian Herrick is leaving Buffalo and coming to Philadelphia. Don't ever meet me in a dark alley. And so that's my introduction of Brian was going to be pretty good. So it was fun working with somebody like Brian because he was easy to work with and really knows what he's doing. This case was also kind of fun because one of the things you think about when you prosecute cases is the deterrent effect. Does it send a message not only to the particular defendant, but to other people? And you could have taken, any number of cases where someone had gotten into somebody else's email and charged it, but it never would have gotten the kind of broad publicity that this case got because it involved two newscasters. And I remember hearing somebody tell me that they heard from a friend of theirs comment something to the effect of, well, I knew it's wrong to get into somebody else's email account, but I didn't realize it was a crime. And I thought, then this case had exactly the impact that we wanted it to have, that it served as an education for the public that these kind of behaviors are criminal.
Brian?
I appreciate Mike mentioning Marty Littlefield. I consider Marty a mentor. Really the first AUSA that I worked with in my FBI career up in the Western District of New York. Again, a very talented litigator who had very good technical skills and could articulate those very complex cases when he needed to. Thinking back about this case, what bothered me most, and I think as an investigator, you rightly should be bothered by the criminal activity. But to Mike's point, he just made people logging into an account and seeing information. Well, okay, is that really a problem? But I think with Menti's attempt to kind of put his thumb on the scale of justice with respect to Lane's ongoing legal battle by leaking information that could have had a really significant impact. Ultimately, I don't know if we mentioned it during the case, but ultimately her case in New York, her criminal case against the police officer gets dismissed and she moves on. But, there was a real concern there that Menti could have influenced the course of justice. And, I think for, certainly Jerry, you and Mike and me, our call to service was to make sure justice is served. And so that aspect of the case and his actions really bothered me, that he was trying to take it into the outcome of her legal battle into his own hands and alter its course to his benefit. But no, I've appreciated the discussion. I enjoy hearing about all these cases from across the Bureau now 2+ years into retirement. It's kind of a way to stay in touch with some of the great work the Bureau's done over its history. Thanks for having us, Jerry.
And that's the end of the interview. In your podcast app's description of this episode, there's a link to the show notes at jerrywilliams.com, where you'll find a video and case-related images of Menti and Alicia Lane, and links to news articles about the Larry Menti computer hacking case. I hope you enjoyed the interview and that you'll share it with your friends, family, and associates. You can show me just how much you liked it by buying me a coffee. There's a link in your podcast app's description of this episode, or you can visit jerrywilliams.com and tap on the little coffee cup icon in the bottom right-hand corner of my website. Don't forget to follow FBI Retired Case File Review on your favorite podcast app. Now, this podcast is all about true crime, but if you're also interested in crime fiction, once a month via my reader team email, I keep you up to date on the FBI and books, TV, and movies. When you join my reader team, you get access to my FBI reading resource, a colorful list of more than 70 books about the FBI written by FBI agents who have been guests on this podcast. There's nonfiction, crime fiction, true crime, and memoirs. You'll also get my FBI reality checklist, where I debunk 20 cliches about the FBI. and receive news about what I'm up to and about my FBI nonfiction and crime fiction books. I want to thank you for listening to the very end. I hope you come back for another episode of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. Thank you.